Why did the federal government classify Elvis Presley's 1970 White meeting for over 3 decades? When the documents were finally released in 2002, archivists discovered something disturbing. Sections of the meeting notes had been redacted. Entire paragraphs were blacked out. The National Archives received more Freedom of Information Act requests for the Elvis Nixon photograph than any other document in U.S. history. But what people really wanted to know was hidden in the classified memos. Did Elvis Presley actually work as a federal informant? The meeting was supposed to be about a badge, a symbolic gesture to satisfy a rock star's ego. But Elvis's handwritten letter to Nixon, discovered years later, revealed he wasn't asking for a souvenir. He was volunteering to infiltrate the anti-war movement, monitor drug use in Hollywood, and report directly to the FBI. Bureau of Narcotics officials tried to shut it down. They knew Elvis himself was using prescription drugs, Demerol, Dilaudid, amphetamines, but Nixon's team overruled them. The badge was issued, and then for 7 years Elvis carried it everywhere, flashing it at airports, police checkpoints, and concert venues. Some say it was delusion. Others believe he was actually reporting back. The truth is still buried in those redacted files. But before we uncover what really happened in the Oval Office that day, make sure you're subscribed, because the story you're about to hear has been hidden from the public for 50 years, and every detail matters. Elvis Presley sat alone in the first-class lounge, scribbling on American Airlines stationery. His handwriting was erratic, the letters slanting across the page in a frenzy of purpose. He had left Memphis without telling anyone. Not his wife Priscilla, not his manager Colonel Tom Parker, not even his trusted bodyguards. He was 48 hours into a spontaneous mission that had consumed him completely, and nothing was going to stop him. The 6-page letter he was writing was addressed to President Richard Nixon, and it began with a sentence that would define the rest of his life. "Dear Mr. President, I can and will be of any service that I can to help the country out." What Elvis was proposing wasn't a publicity stunt or a celebrity endorsement. He was offering himself as a weapon, a cultural icon willing to turn against the very youth movement that had once worshipped him. He wanted to become a federal narcotics agent, armed with a badge that would give him the power to move freely through airports, carry firearms without permits, and infiltrate the counterculture circles that Nixon's administration couldn't reach. But there was something else driving Elvis. Something he didn't write in the letter, a gnawing fear that his relevance was slipping away, that the world had moved on without him, and that this badge might be the only thing that could restore his sense of control. What Elvis didn't know was that the FBI had been watching him for years. The flight to Washington, D.C. was quiet. Elvis sat in his seat, wearing a purple velvet suit, a gold belt buckle the size of a dinner plate, and sunglasses that covered half his face. In his carry-on bag were gifts for the president, photographs of his wife and daughter, a collection of police badges he had accumulated from departments across the country, and a loaded Colt .45 pistol wrapped in a handkerchief. He had no appointment, no scheduled meeting, no confirmation that Nixon would even see him. But Elvis had always believed that charisma could open any door, and he was betting everything on the chance that the most powerful man in the world would be curious enough to say yes. When the plane touched down at Washington National Airport on the morning of December 21st, Elvis went straight to the White House gates. He handed his handwritten letter to a guard, who stared at him in disbelief. The guard disappeared inside, and Elvis waited. Minutes felt like hours. Then, impossibly, the message came back. President Nixon would see him. But what happened next would remain classified for 30 years. To understand why Elvis showed up at the White House that December morning, you have to go back to the weeks before, to the slow unraveling that had been building for months. By late 1970, Elvis was trapped in a cycle of performances and prescription pills that left him hollow. The Vegas residency that had revitalized his career in 1969 had become a prison. 2 shows a night, 6 nights a week, the same songs, the same costumes, the same screaming crowds. Backstage, between performances, Elvis would sit in his dressing room surrounded by pill bottles, uppers to get him through the show, downers to help him sleep afterward. His personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, was writing prescriptions at an alarming rate, but Elvis always wanted more. He had built a network of compliant doctors across the country, each one unaware of what the others were prescribing, each one contributing to a chemical cocktail that was slowly destroying him. In early December, Elvis had walked off stage in the middle of a performance, telling his band he couldn't breathe, couldn't focus, couldn't remember the lyrics. The incident was kept quiet, but it terrified him. For the first time in his life, his body was failing him on stage, the one place where he had always felt invincible. That's when the idea began to form. He needed a new purpose, a new identity. Elvis had always collected police badges. It started innocently enough in the 50s, when local sheriffs would present him with honorary deputy badges as a gesture of goodwill. But over the years, the collection became an obsession. He would call police departments in cities where he was performing and ask to meet with the chief, angling for another badge to add to his collection. He displayed them in his home like trophies, and he wore them sometimes when he traveled, showing them to airport security or police officers as if they carried real authority. To Elvis, these badges represented something he desperately craved: legitimacy outside of music, respect from institutions of power, a sense that he was more than just an entertainer. But none of them were real. They were ceremonial, symbolic, meaningless beyond the gesture. And Elvis knew it. What he wanted was a badge that carried actual federal authority, one that would make him untouchable. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge became his obsession. He had heard about it from a Denver police captain who mentioned that federal narcotics agents had extraordinary powers. They could carry weapons across state lines, bypass local law enforcement, operate with a level of autonomy that local badges could never provide. That's what Elvis wanted. Not just a souvenir, but power. So he decided to go straight to the top, to the president himself. The Oval Office was smaller than Elvis had imagined. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the presidential desk. Nixon stood when Elvis entered, extending his hand with the practiced ease of a politician who had shaken 10,000 hands before. But there was something in Nixon's expression, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even suspicion, that told Elvis this wasn't going to be a simple photo opportunity. Elvis launched into his pitch immediately, speaking rapidly, his southern drawl thickening with urgency. He told Nixon about the drug epidemic ravaging American youth, about the Beatles and their influence on the counterculture, about the hippies and anti-war protesters who were tearing the country apart. He said he had credibility with young people because he had earned the right to be listened to, and that with the right badge he could go undercover, infiltrate the movement, and report back to the government. Nixon listened, nodding occasionally, but saying little. What Elvis didn't realize was that the president's advisor, Egil Krogh, was taking notes, detailed, careful notes that would later be filed away in the National Archives, classified until long after both men were dead. The notes revealed something nobody expected. Elvis was unraveling. Krogh's memo described Elvis as on edge, speaking in rapid bursts about communist conspiracies, the dangers of psychedelic drugs, and his belief that rock music had been weaponized against American values. Elvis pulled out his collection of police badges, spreading them across Nixon's desk like trading cards, explaining that he had been made an honorary deputy in dozens of cities, but that none of them carried real authority. What he wanted, what he needed, was a badge from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the federal agency responsible for enforcing drug laws. With that badge, Elvis believed, he would have immunity. He could carry guns, transport pills, cross state lines without question. He could operate in the shadows, untouchable. Nixon seemed intrigued, but the request was unusual, and the president wasn't about to authorize it on the spot. He turned to Krogh and asked if it was possible. Krogh hesitated. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs wasn't in the habit of issuing badges to civilians, especially not to rock stars with documented prescription drug habits. But Nixon had already made up his mind. He wanted Elvis to have the badge. The question was, why? Some historians believe Nixon saw Elvis as a useful propaganda tool, a way to connect with the so-called silent majority of middle-class Americans who were exhausted by the chaos of the late 60s. Others think Nixon simply enjoyed the spectacle, the king of rock and roll in the Oval Office, begging for a badge like a child asking for a toy. But there's a darker theory, one that emerged decades later when researchers began digging through the classified files. The theory suggests that Nixon's team saw Elvis not as an ally, but as a potential liability, a drug-addicted celebrity whose erratic behavior could become a national embarrassment. By giving him the badge, they could monitor him more closely, keep him dependent on their approval, and ensure that if he ever became a problem, they would have leverage. The badge wasn't a gift, it was a leash, and Elvis, desperate for validation, never saw it coming. He left the Oval Office that morning carrying the badge in his hand, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. The iconic photograph was taken moments later. Elvis shaking Nixon's hand, both men smiling for the camera, neither one fully understanding what had just happened. But the real story was in the files that stayed hidden. What most people don't know is that behind the scenes, a fierce bureaucratic battle was raging over whether Elvis should receive the badge at all. John Finlater, the deputy director of the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, was furious when he received the request from the White House. Finlater had spent his entire career building the Bureau's credibility, fighting to establish federal drug enforcement as a serious professional operation. The idea of handing a badge to a celebrity, especially one with Elvis's reputation, was everything he had fought against. Finlater drafted a strongly worded memo arguing that the badge should be denied. He pointed out that Elvis had no law enforcement training, no background in narcotics investigation, and a well-documented history of prescription drug abuse. Giving him a federal badge, Finlater argued, would undermine the Bureau's authority and send the message that the rules didn't apply to the rich and famous. But Finlater's memo never made it to Nixon. Krogh intercepted it and made sure the president only heard the arguments in favor of granting the request. Krogh believed that Elvis could be useful, not as an actual investigator, but as a public relations asset, a famous face who could be trotted out to show that even rock stars supported the government's anti-drug efforts. When Finlater was told that the decision had been made, he reportedly slammed his fist on his desk and said that it was the worst mistake the Bureau would ever make. He was overruled, and on December 21, 1970, Elvis Aaron Presley became the holder of a Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge, serial number unknown, authority level ceremonial. The badge itself was supposed to be symbolic, a gesture of appreciation, nothing more. But nobody told Elvis that. To him it was real. It was proof that the government trusted him, needed him, saw him as more than just a singer, and he was going to use it. What followed was 7 years of escalating delusion and desperation. Elvis started carrying the badge everywhere. He would flash it at airport security when they questioned the contents of his luggage, which often included firearms and large quantities of prescription pills. He showed it to police officers who pulled him over for speeding, and most of them, starstruck and confused, would let him go. He used it to gain access to restricted areas, backstage at concerts, government buildings, even military bases. In his mind, the badge gave him the authority to do whatever he wanted, and for a while it seemed to work. But the people around Elvis knew the truth. His bodyguards, his friends, even Priscilla, they all saw that the badge was feeding his worst impulses, giving him a justification for behavior that was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. Elvis started talking about going undercover, about using his fame to infiltrate drug rings and report back to the FBI. He would tell elaborate stories about meetings with federal agents, about secret missions he was planning, about how he was working directly with the government to clean up Hollywood. There's no evidence that any of this was real. No FBI records, no bureau reports, no confirmation from anyone in law enforcement that Elvis ever provided intelligence or participated in any investigation. It was all in his head, a fantasy he needed to believe. By 1973, the fantasy was crumbling. Elvis's marriage to Priscilla ended in divorce, and with it went one of the last stabilizing forces in his life. His drug use escalated to dangerous levels. His personal physician later estimated that Elvis was consuming over 10,000 pills per year, a staggering cocktail of stimulants, sedatives, and painkillers that would have killed most people. His weight ballooned, then dropped, then ballooned again as his body struggled to process the chemical assault. On stage he forgot lyrics, slurred his words, sometimes stopped mid-song to ramble incoherently to the audience. The man who had once been the embodiment of youth and vitality was now a cautionary tale, and everyone could see it except Elvis himself. He still carried the badge. He still talked about his work with the government. He still believed he was serving a higher purpose. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. A man destroying himself with drugs while claiming to fight the drug epidemic. But Elvis had spent his entire life performing, playing roles, becoming whatever the audience wanted him to be. The federal agent was just another character, another mask to hide behind, and the government let him keep wearing it. When researchers finally gained access to the full archive in the early 2000s, they discovered something even more disturbing. The Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs had initially refused to issue the badge. The agency's deputy director, John Finlater, wrote a memo arguing that giving Elvis a federal badge would be inappropriate and potentially dangerous, given his known drug use and erratic behavior. But Finlater's objections were overruled by the White House. Krogh personally intervened, ordering the Bureau to issue the badge as a courtesy to the president. The memo documenting this decision was buried in the classified files, hidden from public view until long after Elvis was dead. Why was it classified? The official explanation is that it contained sensitive information about Bureau procedures. But some researchers believe the real reason was simpler. It was embarrassing. It revealed that the Nixon administration had knowingly given a federal narcotics badge to a man who was actively abusing narcotics. It exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of the war on drugs, the way powerful people could bend the rules while ordinary Americans were being arrested and imprisoned for the same behavior. But there's one more piece of the puzzle, one that has never been fully explained. In the months following the Oval Office meeting, Elvis's behavior became increasingly paranoid. He started talking about surveillance, about people watching him, about threats from unnamed enemies. He installed security systems at Graceland that rivaled military installations. He surrounded himself with armed bodyguards, some of whom were former law enforcement officers with FBI connections. And he began carrying multiple firearms, handguns, rifles, even submachine guns, claiming he needed them for protection. Some of his inner circle believed he was genuinely afraid. Others thought he was delusional, lost in a fantasy world where he was a secret agent fighting shadowy enemies. But there's a third possibility, one that the redacted files hint at but never fully confirm. What if Elvis actually was being watched? What if the FBI's surveillance didn't stop after he received the badge? What if the government saw him as a potential security risk, a loose cannon who knew too much and talked too freely? The redacted sections of the meeting notes could contain references to ongoing surveillance operations, to informants placed within Elvis's inner circle, to wiretaps and monitoring that continued until his death. We may never know for certain. The files are still partially classified, and the people who could answer these questions are long gone, but the photograph remains. Elvis and Nixon, frozen in time, smiling for a camera that captured everything except the truth. By 1976, Elvis's health was deteriorating rapidly. He had been hospitalized multiple times for drug-related complications, and his concerts were becoming increasingly unpredictable. Sometimes he would deliver brilliant performances that reminded audiences of his former glory. Other times, he could barely make it through a single song. The badge was still with him, still in his possession, but it had become a symbol of everything that was wrong. Instead of giving him purpose, it had enabled his worst behaviors. Instead of making him feel powerful, it had isolated him further from reality. His bodyguards later wrote in their memoir, "Elvis, What Happened?" that the badge had become an obsession, that Elvis would spend hours staring at it, talking about the missions he was going to undertake, the difference he was going to make. But those missions never materialized. The only battle Elvis was fighting was the one inside himself, and he was losing. The day Elvis died, he was found on the bathroom floor with 14 different drugs in his system. Among his possessions, carefully stored in a display case in his office, was the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs badge, the badge he had fought so hard to get. The badge he believed gave him power and purpose. It had been nearly 7 years since the Oval Office meeting, and in that time, nothing had changed. Elvis was still chasing validation, still trying to prove he mattered, still hiding behind costumes and fantasies. The badge couldn't save him from himself. It couldn't stop the pills, the paranoia, the slow collapse of a man who had lost control of his own life. But it did serve one final purpose. It became a symbol, a perfect encapsulation of everything Elvis Presley represented. The American dream twisted into something dark and tragic. The boy from Tupelo who became a king, only to discover that the throne was a prison. Today, over 45 years after his death, the Elvis Nixon photograph is the most requested image in the National Archives. Millions of people have seen it, studied it, tried to understand what it means. But the full story, the classified memos, the redacted files, the surveillance reports remains incomplete. Some sections are still hidden, still protected by government secrecy laws. And as long as those files stay sealed, the question will remain: did Elvis Presley work as a federal informant, or was he just a desperate man, clinging to a fantasy that the government was happy to exploit? The truth is buried somewhere in those redacted paragraphs, in the blacked-out lines and missing pages. And maybe that's fitting, because Elvis's entire life was about performance, about the difference between image and reality. The badge was just another prop. The meeting was just another show. And the audience, all of us, are still trying to figure out where the performance ended and the real Elvis began. The files may never tell us, but the photograph will always remind us. Sometimes the most powerful images are the ones that hide the most.